Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on which side of the country you're from. Welcome to this morning's webinar. We thank you for your patience as we get started, and we've just been waiting for a few more people to come in. It's great to have you here this morning. We've got a sensational panel on board. Before we start, I'll just introduce myself. My name's Wayne Bradshaw. I'm the Development Manager at the Fathering Project, and I'm hosting the session this morning, or this afternoon. Of course, I'm in Western Australia, so I keep referring to morning. Before we start, I'd just like to conduct an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Fathering Project acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So this morning we've got a great panel on board, and to provide some great insights and discussion around the topic that we have today. Before we get started, we just want to touch base on the concept of masculinity to provide a baseline and a reason for a call to change. On International Men's Day, we see there's an opportunity to address the issues of male suicide, which is a leading cause of death for men aged 15 to 44 years. And importantly, 37% of men are not satisfied with the quality of their relationships because they do not feel emotionally connected or supported. So let's address some of the issues of masculinity and explore the benefits of a healthy masculinity. So the aim today is to expand the conversation. We know there's a whole host of research around the impact of healthy masculinity, the ability to connect and emotionally express ourselves, and they all have an impact on men's well-being. We want to look at how we can change the dialogue, how we can turn the research shows the positivity of healthy masculinity into a practice. So as in using International Men's Day as a platform, we want to broaden the conversation and we want to collaborate to advance the conversation, initiate change in the family, workplace and the community. So our first speaker today that we're going to have is David Lesser. Now, David is a 40-year career journalist. He's been in the Middle East and Washington, DC, and is a feature writer in Australia for the Murdoch, Packer and Fairfax organisations. He's covered murder trials, demonstrations, uprising, war zones and peace conferences in America, the Middle East and Europe, and the Asia Pacific region. So if I can call David in now and he can present his keynote speech. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks very much, Wayne. Thanks for having me today. So I've been asked to talk on the sources and limitations of traditional masculinity. Obviously a very, very small subject. Each culture obviously produces its own kind of masculinity. An Irishman is not an Indian. Men wheel prams in Denmark. They don't tend to do so in Delhi. There are good men, there are dangerous men, physical men, bookish men, old world men, new age men. And there's Donald Trump. There's also the Dalai Lama. Nonetheless, I think there are some common denominators which speak to this so-called source of traditional masculinity. And I might come at this with an anecdote. In 2018, in the wake of the Me Too movement, I was commissioned to write a cover story for Good Weekend magazine called Women, Men and the Whole Damn Thing. And it led to a book of the same name published the following year, which was last year. And in both article and book, I wanted to explore as a journalist and as a man, as a father of daughters, as a brother to a sister, as a son to a mother, as a friend and colleague to many wonderful women, the universal crimes that women were now attesting to in all their fury from all over the world. Stories of violence and coercion, stories of rape, mutilation and silencing, stories of men refusing to take no for an answer, stories of horrifying emotional and psychological abuse, stories of humiliating and shaming, stories of workplace gender pay gaps and institutionalized enabling, where confidentiality clauses were designed to shut women up. After my initial essay, I received countless messages of thanks and support from here and around the world. But I also received some unpleasant messages, including from this man. It read as follows: "Fuck you in your rotting heart, laser man, and piss on your children, and keep your mother's period blood away from my Eucharist." Now, I'm still not quite sure I understand that little missive, but when I received it, it got me thinking about some of the passages in the Bible that I'd read in my research. The book of Leviticus. When a woman has a discharge and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be rendered unclean. The book of Deuteronomy. If a woman is found not to be a virgin on her wedding night, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of her town shall stone her to death. The book of Genesis. A wife's desire shall be for her husband, and he shall rule over her. Who was it who decided that a woman was impure and unclean when she was menstruating? That she could be murdered for having exercised her right to sexual sovereignty? That a man could rule over a woman with impunity? Well, men did, the men who feared and desired her in equal measure. And the church fathers reinforced these Old Testament views with ruthlessness and vigor. Tertullian, the founder of Western theology, claimed that the vagina was a temple built over a sewer and the devil's gateway. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential Christian philosophers in history, declared a woman to be a, quote, incomplete man and an incidental being. St. Augustine proclaimed a woman to be a beast who is neither firm nor stable. Aristotle, one of the towering figures in ancient Greece, said, "The female is female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities." This was the caste system that came to define and inform the religious and philosophical moral order of Western civilization, and one that I think still shapes our thinking. It is there in our religions, our ideologies, our literature, our art, our institutions, and never mind whether you're pious or atheist, religious or agnostic. These are the systems and structures that have been laid down over centuries. This is the alphabet soup of patriarchy, the culture that has for centuries programmed men and boys to think of themselves as superior to women and girls. And we see it everywhere today, in the White House, the US Supreme Court, Congress, the British House of Commons, Australian parliaments, both federal and state, the Swedish Academy, the United Nations, Hollywood, the media, big business, small business, the legal sector, the rural sector, the military, the music industry, academia, medicine, science, sport, charities. It's a view by men, not all men, of course, that men should be in charge, that men should lead, that women are inferior and of less value, and that they are there for the taking. It wasn't always like this. Prior to the great origin myths, where Eve was born from Adam's rib, prior to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prior to Christ being declared the Son of God, prior to Muhammad emerging as Allah's prophet, societies throughout the Middle East, Asia, and Europe revered the feminine. Goddesses, priestesses, healers, physicians, lawmakers, even warriors. In fact, female deities were regarded in many parts of the world as the creators of existence. There were, in fact, no gods worshipped in ancient Europe up until about 2400 BC, which is when a succession of Indo-European invasions began introducing to the world a masculine version of the creator, who later became known, of course, in Greece as Zeus, in Rome as Jupiter, to the Hebrews as Yahweh. And that's when women began to lose their rights to property, their sexual freedom, their influence on public life, and when matrilineal kinship and customs of descent began to be replaced by patrilineal clans, often violently. And curiously and importantly, part of men's upgraded status only came from the growing realization, which was first captured in the Hittite myths in 1600 BC, that women's magical capacity to give birth was not the result of the wind or the rivers impregnating them, as previously thought. It was men. And once the relevance of coitus to childbearing was officially admitted, men's status began to gradually improve. But before this, women enjoyed as much access to food, protection, social support, and sexual freedom as men. And the anthropological literature is filled with rich examples of women's sexual freedom in various parts of the world. But since the advent of the monotheistic faiths, women essentially found themselves divided into two categories: the pure and the tainted, the nurturing and the corrupted, the revered and the repellent, the Madonna and the whore. And this reductionism and demonization would result in men going to extraordinary lengths to control female libido: female genital mutilation, head-to-toe chadors, medieval witch burnings, chastity belts, suffocating corsets. It became part of a war on women and girls that was to be waged for centuries. But it wasn't just a war against women and girls. It was a war against the feminine, against feminine values. And I think Carl Jung gave us a useful framework for understanding this just over 100 years ago. And he believed we were all born with archetypal feminine and masculine qualities. He called the archetypal feminine qualities, of course, the anima, qualities of tenderness and compassion and vulnerability, relatedness and intuition. He called the archetypal masculine qualities animus, qualities of courage, assertiveness, analytical thought, logic, reason, and a drive for achievement. All of us carry these qualities inside us from birth. And at best, these qualities are supposed to work together to create an authentic, balanced wholeness. But they don't, because men have trained to be at the mercy of their logic and reason, to know, to be right, to be pragmatic, and in particular, to not show weakness, to be in control of one's emotions. And this denial of tenderness and vulnerability is deeply imbued in men. And it's learnt first in childhood, and it's reinforced in the schoolyard, and it's burnished bright with posture and swagger in sporting clubs, universities, corporate boardrooms, and of course, through centuries of militarization, of defining masculinity through war. Never mind what men really feel, putting their hearts on the line carries too many risks, because in fighting to live up to the tyranny of masculinity, men become driven to do anything to prove they are neither tender nor weak nor insecure. And I believe this fear of being seen as weak or vulnerable keeps boys and men paralyzed. And it sits at the heart of so much men's rage, whether expressed through murder, rape, domestic violence, suicide, alcoholism, reckless driving, or just a sullen withdrawal from the world. And I think this is quite possibly the first act of violence the patriarchy commits, this wholesale assault on the qualities of softness and vulnerability, of emotional attachment that resides inside a man. The models of manhood, of traditional masculinity that we've been given, can often look like strength and power, but they are models that remove men from their hearts, and they leave men feeling isolated and vulnerable, and all too often prone to violent and abusive behaviour. Australian writer Tim Winton put it beautifully a couple of years ago when he talked about what models of traditional masculinity do to once sweet, tender, delicious little boys. You start out with all the colours in the pencil box as a child, he said, and then somehow you get to middle age and all you've got left in the pencil box is black, purple, and dark blue. There's your colours, go live a life with that. Healthy masculinity is the full colour spectrum. As the Jesuit Social Services Man Box study noted, it enables a man to treat women and girls with the same kindness and respect with which he would like to be treated. It enables a man to advocate for women and men. It enables a man to nurture friendships and to enjoy the company and affection of other men without feeling his manhood is under threat. It allows a man to be honest with himself about his feelings, needs, and desires. It prevents a man from using his power in the workplace to make women feel unsafe. But it's hard to know how to be a healthy man if you're growing up with a mask and all the insecurities concealed behind the mask, where the fear of being seen as weak actually cripples you psychically. You live with the peer pressure to objectify and denigrate girls to prove your manhood. You spend hours each day watching porn, playing video games, having your brain rewired in the opposite direction of connection and intimacy. You follow the rituals of power and the bristling hostility and pecking order that men often impose on each other. All the stock definitions of masculinity that prevent boys from dealing with the storms and subtleties inside their hearts. This is the man box we hear so much about, and it is crippling to boys and men because it creates a world where male suicide, as Wayne pointed out at the beginning, is at epidemic levels, where men are living on average 6 years less than women, where in 4 out of 5 marriage breakdowns, men are the ones being left. It creates a world where among boys and young men, there is more obesity, homelessness, schizophrenia, and attention deficit disorder than ever before, and where young men are entering university in fewer numbers, and where in schools, the majority of children with behavioural problems and learning difficulties are boys. So we know, I think, that violence against women is actually the greatest form of violence on the planet today. And it's my contention that if men attack or are in conflict with women in the outer world, it's because there's a conflict within their own psyches towards their feminine qualities. They've been raised to reject and scorn the feminine. So why should it be surprising that they then grow into men who disrespect women, who see them as less than fully human? In a sense, men have been raised to be terrified of women because they're actually terrified of themselves. They're terrified of their inner feeling life, of what William Buckley Yeats called the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, because they've been forced to cage and kill the feminine within their own beings, and consequently the world. James Baldwin, the great African-American writer, once wrote that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I believe this is part of what we all have to face today. If we're to reject the old definitions of masculinity, models we've been given for traditional masculinity, which fail to recognize a fundamental truth, which is that nothing meaningful in life ever happens without the ability to be vulnerable. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That was incredible. An incredible perspective. We're now going to bring in the panelists, and we're going to ask them to address the issues of how can we change our psyche? How can we challenge the current model? So in introducing our panelists, we'd just like to ask them to just turn their screens on. So we've now got Rob and myself, Wayne Bradshaw. So welcome, Rob, Paul, and unfortunately, it looks like Tom might not be able to bring his screen up. So regrettably, we won't be able to see Tom's pretty face, handsome face on us this afternoon. So with us, we've got Tom, who's on audio. Tom's got an extensive background in training through Tomorrow Man, the Reach Foundation, the Man Up Initiative, elite sports teams, and young men in general. He's an excellent practitioner. Paul Collings. Paul is a consultant, facilitator, and coach working with a range of clients in the areas of organisational culture, senior team effectiveness, and leadership development. And Rob Sturrock. Rob's an advocate, author, and working father of 2 children. He writes widely about fatherhood, gender equity or gender equality, healthy masculinity for publications such as Mamma Mia, Sydney Morning Herald, and SBS. He's a regular contributor and commentator on radio and TV, and he's also an author, Man Raises Boy. So with that, we'll start off with our panel discussion. And the first question is to Tom. Tom, you're working in the front line, working with boys and young men every day. How do they talk to you and with each other about masculinity? What gives you cause for concern, and what gives you the hope that we can reframe masculinity?
Big question. I just want to check that you can hear me for starters.
All good,
Brilliant.
Tom.
Okay, I can see you, so I feel a little bit creepy. But where do we begin? Listen, I think what gives a little bit of rise for concern, well, a lot, is going into work with young men. We usually work with kind of year 10s and above because they're starting to be, exposed to all the adult aspects of life at that age, and make real decisions about who they want to be. It's the ease of the stereotype that rolls off their tongues. When we say what is a man, it's lightning quick. He's tough, he's strong, he provides, he's emotionless unless it's about anger or maybe a bit of laughing, like taking the piss, or a bit of like numbness. Sometimes they'll say, but none of the tears. What does he drink? Beer, not wine. What does he eat? Meat, not salad. It just rolls off. He's big and he's hairy. He's tough, and all of those kind of things. And it is funny. You know what I mean? Like there's a banter that kind of lights up the room, and they're all just like bang, 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 bang. They don't need to think for a second about it. That's scary, because what it means is it's just resting on their unconscious, just ready to roll out. And the other thing that's scary is, in one of the workshops that we run, after we've had all this banter, we'll ask for 5 volunteers. And generally it's the blokes that are like, nah, stuff this, I don't care, I'm going to jump up and have a bit of fun. And then we get another 5 guys to volunteer. And then we give the second volunteers a little bottle of red nail polish. And we ask them to put it on both hands, all nails of the guy that volunteered first. Now, what usually kicks off is a whole lot of banter and a whole lot of, the audience, suck, you get the gist. But they're like, I'm glad you're doing this. They're laughing at each other, they're ribbing each other. In all honesty, there's a bit of homophobic, overtone to what happens, in terms of some of the comments that they're making. But the bigger thing is when we tell the volunteers, hey, what you've agreed to now that you've got it on, because often there's a bit tongue-in-cheek, yeah, whatever, slap it on, blah, blah. Definitely not doing it delicately, because they wouldn't want to be seen doing that. If they are doing it delicately, then the boys give them hell for it. But once it's on, they're told they've got to leave it on for 2 weeks, and then the real reaction begins. And usually it's anger. It's either anger or fear, which we know is the basis of anger anyway, when you've got that hurt and you're cornered and you kind of lash out. So that is really scary. The other thing that's a bit scary and cause for concern is that they just have no idea who wrote these rules. So when we ask them, who wrote the rule that women wear red nail polish, men don't, they come up with all sorts of weird stuff. Donald Trump, the fashion police, but they can't actually name it, and yet they're terrified to break it. And they're terrified to break it because they go, my dad's going to clip me over the ear, or the boys are going to give me hell at footy training, or I can't go to work looking like this. And you really see the fear in them. Like they're really going, I don't want to break this rule. I don't want to be rejected. I don't want to be judged. I don't want to be seen as other than manly. So those things are concerning. I think buried in the extreme stats, like the suicide stats, I think that what's really scary about that is that a lot of men would rather kill themselves than kill the idea of themselves as a man. And that's just deeply terrifying. I would rather check out of life and miss out on the wonder of the whole experience of this thing than being seen as less than man. And because I need to reach out for help, and because I don't have the answers and I'm genuinely vulnerable and I'm genuinely struggling, I don't have any option. I need to defy this idea. The hope piece, the hope is that, as David said, like you begin with, quoting Tim Winton, you begin with all the colours. You begin with emotional range, and it doesn't take much. We're in the room with 2 hours with these guys, and often emotion is just, flying within half an hour. Once they realise that the coast is clear, it's safe, they're not going to be judged, they're not going to be rejected and kicked out by their mates, they have emotional life just below the surface. Now, I wish I could say the same for the older guys that we work with, but often it's buried a little bit deeper at that point. So the hope that I feel is the emotional poetry that comes out of these guys, they really want it. You know what I mean? Like if you give them the option, if you give them a charismatic example of a man doing emotion, they're like, I'm in on that. If that's what it looks like, I'm in. But they've got a myth in their head that as soon as they emote, they're going to turn into a woman. Now, that's really scary, as David framed. You know what I mean? The fact that we have this kind of internal, I would never want to be seen as a woman. But that is the fear that they have. And so when they see a man doing emotion, doesn't look like a woman, they have a pathway at least to begin exploring a broader expression of masculinity. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Thanks, Tom. Just a quick question around media. When you see people like Donald Trump justifying their appalling behaviour in terms of lack of respect for women, about calling it locker room talk, do you come across that and stuff? How do you address that with your groups when you're talking to them?
Yeah, listen, it definitely comes up. And there's unfortunately a lot of guys out there that do love Donald Trump. And he's kind of stuff everybody, stick a finger to the world nature. I think we're in a really interesting time, and that's what we'll often talk to the guys about. We're in this really interesting time where there is a shift going on. And I think a lot of men are scared that we're losing what we've had. And, you know, a lot of young boys feel like there's a beat up going on men and masculinity, and they're feeling in the kind of target zone of that. And I do think we need to wade into that conversation and help them understand what they're experiencing. More so, give them, attractive pathways and capabilities where they feel able for these conversations. Because a lot of these guys just don't feel able for the conversation. They feel, as soon as you start speaking, you just get slammed. And so, you know, when you're teaching a guy to, play sport, 10 times more than you're teaching him how to have an in-depth emotive conversation, then how do you expect them to wade into that tricky, murky territory of the real dilemma that we're facing at the moment, of how we create an equal footing between men and women, and get rid of the claustrophobic expectations that women face, as well as the straitjacket that men face in terms of their stereotypes. It's definitely there, but generally what I talk to them about is, you know, as a young guy, when you're throwing out that stereotype, one of the questions we ask, how do women solve problems different to men? Or how do men solve problems? And they'll say, with fists. Don't talk, because it just goes on and on and on. You never solve it. It's better this way. You just solve it with your fists, and then it's done. You're mates again. And talking to the guys about, hey, just be really careful about what you kind of logging in your brain there, because if you put that in your brain as a command, and that's how you sort a problem out, then you get into real trouble when you're in your 30s. You've got kids, you're trying to hold a job down, things are getting stressed in a marriage, as they always will. And if you're going on autopilot solving problems, we can all see where that leads. And that leads to destroyed lives. Everybody loses in that situation. So just be really careful about the models that you set up that might work for a 16-year-old. It might make him a schoolyard hero and all of those kind of things. But as a man, they just create worlds of pain for the man themselves and everybody else around them.
Let's bring Rob in now. Rob's a different perspective. Rob's a working man, a stay-at-home dad as well, battling the entrenched male breadwinner culture. Rob, was it a difficult decision to take the path that you've taken and did you receive any pushback from your parents or your friends or your employers saying, come on, get out there and work? And what are some of the approaches that you undertook to overcome those issues?
Yeah, look, it wasn't probably a difficult decision to make. I was really keen to be involved in my kids' lives. So for the audience, I've got two young kids. I took parental leave for the two of them when they were less than 12 months old to be their primary carer. A lot of what Tom and David spoke about really resonates with me. That was the sort of schoolyard culture I saw in terms of masculinity. And then, as you said, Wayne, you add on to that that expectation of being the male breadwinner, that the best way to provide for a family and to provide for children is to earn a big paycheck, work long hours, and leave the emotional and sort of cognitive side of parenting to your partner. I was determined to sort of break that mold. Like, I wanted to be involved in my kids' lives. It took a lot of unpacking, I think, with my wife about how to split up parenting as equally as possible. And then also, it involves some awkward conversations at work, because typically organizations have parental leave policies and parental supports for the women in the workforce. There are some more progressive organizations and progressive industries where it is more accommodating for men to be carers. But the default is that men have a couple of days off to meet a baby and then they go back to work. So yes, it involves some awkward conversations about declaring my interests, showing that I wanted to be a father first and foremost, not just a worker, that I really wanted to be a carer, that I wanted to be actively involved in all the dirty and exhausting parts of being a parent. There was some pushback, I think, and it kind of gets to Tom's point about what rolls sort of almost unconsciously off the tongue of people. When I talk to family and friends, they were overwhelmingly supportive of me taking time off work. But the questions they would ask me about why I did it were vastly different to what my wife Julia was getting. And no one batted an eye when Julia was going to take 10 months of mat leave twice for our two kids. But I was taking 3 months for each of our kids, so less than a third at the same time. It's the questions about your career. Well, isn't your boss going to be upset at you being out of the workforce? Aren't you going to get bored at home for that long? Like, what are you going to do for all that time? And is this really a smart idea for you to be stepping out of the workforce? And those are questions that don't get asked of women. They get asked of men. And it implicitly reinforces those biases that should men really be caring. And sort of to the broader big picture of the webinar today, because we want to talk about solutions and positive change. I really think men actively caring for children or caring for other loved ones and other family members is such a powerful daily practical way that we can break this cycle around masculinity. To show your children, to show your partner, to show your co-workers, friends, whoever it may be, that caring, loving, nurturing and raising other people is important to you, and that helps define your identity, your character and your existence, sets a really powerful example for everyone else. And it does help to break down some of those barriers and stigmas. And as Taford's keynote said, they are so well entrenched, they go back millennia. It's a bit daunting to hear it when it's put like that. But I think things like thinking of the ways in your day-to-day life you can change that, challenge that stigma is so important. So for me, caring for my kids, as beautiful as it's been on a personal level, just to be with them, bond with them, and to be sort of co-responsible for their lives, it has also helped to sort of break some of those masculinities. And I hope that by writing about it, by talking to it today, by advocating on it, and just by showing those people in my general life, you show a different way that you can be a man. You show that caring really matters, and that putting other people first is what being a man is all about as well. And I just hope that in the years to come, now that we've had COVID and all its chaos, that we can really see the opportunities open up for men to be carers and to challenge that aspect of masculinity in particular.
Rob, do you think that through COVID there's been a bit of a shift in people working from home and the realisation of the ability to work from home, the ability to, the requirement and the need to be a parent to your kids and not babysit? So the change in lifestyle as a result of COVID may actually help the movement towards, the father taking an active part in raising the kids?
Yeah, look, I think that first point, yes, I think it's going to be conducive. There are people, more dads working from home, working flexibly, and also colleagues seeing kids present on Zoom meetings and the like during the day. That's really helpful. I think that does help sort of change the perceptions of fathers. It brings children to the front center of their lives rather than always sort of being something you might discuss in the kitchen at the office. The big kicker will be, the big challenge is whether we slingshot back to everyone just going back to the office and going back to that male breadwinner culture. This is a country that's kind of got the virus under control. So are we going to see that quote unquote revert back to normal where men go, I'm glad I'm done working from home, back to the office for me? Or can we embed that change? We've seen a little bit of it. And I guess the big question for us and for 2021 is, can we embed that change? Can we help men permanently change the way they work and help to recalibrate their work lives to have caring at the heart of it as well. I think it's probably still a bit early for that, but I'm really hopeful that we can make that bigger change too.
Right, that's a perfect segue into Paul's area in the corporate sphere in terms of the organisational development work that he does in terms of culture and in traditionally male industries. Paul, what are you noticing in the corporate life? What can you tell us around the changing role of men or the work that you're doing in changing the culture of organisations to become more family friendly, more father friendly?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. And I think the first thing is that we really should celebrate the progress we've made. You know, if you look back 10, 20 years, you know, when my kids came into the world 30 or so years ago, a lot of what's available now, it was not available then. So there has been significant progress, both in terms of people generally, but let's talk about men being able to work more flexibly, but in particular in terms of parental leave. And so increasing numbers of organisations are now making it policy and acceptable for men to take significant chunks of time off, just like Rob has done with their kids. And to the point that Wayne, you and Rob made, that COVID is certainly accelerating that trend. I think so. I do a lot of work in, as you mentioned, in male-dominated industries, and particularly with engineering firms at the moment. I'm helping them to create more inclusive cultures. And what I'm hearing increasingly is a lot of people saying things like, "Well, actually, you know, working remotely actually works fine. I never thought this would work, and actually it does work." And so I think, you know, to Rob's hope, I do believe that, of course, some people will go back, but actually we're seeing that trend accelerate, which is good. The other thing that's going on is that younger dads, and again, Rob's a great example, are far more demanding of this now than my generation ever was. So that's driving the change, and organisations are seeing it as necessary to make this change to attract and retain good people. In a lot of professions, we have what they call the war for talent. If you want to get the best people, you've got to attract them and you've got to retain them. And actually having family-friendly workplace policies is one of the key measures. You know, I often hear younger men talking about making a choice in their career, and they're far more likely to make choices that enable them to be the kinds of fathers and partners that they want to be than my generation ever did. So that's great. I think the other thing that's going on is that for many organizations, I don't know whether it's most yet, but certainly for many, many organizations, they are wanting to create more inclusive cultures. Cultures where people, regardless of gender, ethnicity, religion, whatever, feel comfortable to be there, feel included. And one of the ways to do that is to make it so that men feel more comfortable to work flexibly, to work even part-time, to take time off to look after their kids. Because if men start feeling comfortable doing that, then that helps the women to feel more comfortable doing that. And so you get more inclusive cultures. As I mentioned, working a lot with engineering firms at the moment, and I've heard a number of stories from young engineers who have taken time out, a little bit like Rob, have talked about how fantastic that's been. In a workshop just a few weeks ago, someone saying that the time that they'd taken off to be with their kids was actually the best thing they'd ever done. The other thing that we hear in them is older men, and I'll put myself in this category as well, expressing regret that they were not able to have that time, either because it just wasn't possible, or probably like me, I imagine if I'd really pushed it, I might have been able to do it, but it didn't fit. And it would have tagged me differently to some of my colleagues. We had a story in the workshop just recently where a man who had insisted on taking time out or leaving work early to go and pick his kids up from school and so on, he'd been labelled as a so-called family man. And actually he was taken off the leadership path because of that. And so, you know, we're in this phase now where in some organisations it's going ahead and senior leaders are supportive of it. In other places, the policies aren't yet there and senior leaders are not supportive of it. And then there's organisations right on the spectrum across there. So I think it is appropriate to be glad for and to celebrate the progress we've made. But I think we also need to be realistic about the state of things, back to what David and Rob have talked about. The male breadwinner belief is alive and strong. The Manbox survey that David had referred to, that was back in 2018, and 55% of young men agreed with the statement, men should be the ones who bring the money home to provide for their families, not women. 55% believe that. That's young men. So amongst older men, I would imagine that that proportion would be higher. And those male leaders, either explicitly or implicitly, and in subtle ways and not so subtle ways, can make it uncomfortable for younger men to work more flexibly, to have time with their families. And so we find that in our work, one of the key things that we do is to give men an opportunity to reflect on where these beliefs have come from. Now, going back to what Tom said, who made these rules? It's a great question. And back to what David said about the origins of some of these things going back millennia. What we find is that when men are given the opportunity to reflect on where these beliefs have come from, so we talk about, what were our families like growing up? And of course, the majority of senior leaders in today's organizations, for the majority of them, they grew up in traditional families where dad worked, dad's work was the emphasis, mum didn't work, she looked after the kids. So that's what they've grown up with. And then that whole, we just take that into ourselves by osmosis as our set of beliefs about how things should be. Those beliefs then get reinforced by all of the things that David talked about. What goes on in sporting clubs at school, amongst friends. What Tom mentioned about how the boys responded to having red nail polish on and so on. So there's a very, very strong reinforcing mechanisms around those beliefs. But what's really encouraging, a little bit like Tom talked about, that the boys are willing to open up, although they're a bit nervous about it. What we find in our workshops is that actually older men are willing to open up about this as well, and to talk about some of their regrets, and to talk about how they were brought up and the experiences they had when they were younger, and how that's played into who they are now, and the regrets they have around that. So I do believe that, this is working with very mainstream men in engineering firms. So I do believe there is I would say, a yearning to address this and actually to ask that question, who made the rules and why the hell are we going along with them? When men start to see this, they start to become much more willing and open to consider new policies, to consider working more flexibly themselves, to consider taking off parental leave and stuff like that. And, so I do feel like it's going to be lengthy, but we're in a transition phase. Things have definitely improved. But these beliefs, like all the previous speakers have said, are deeply held. It's just going to take time for us to shift away from them, I guess, yeah.
Thanks, Paul. I just might make a couple of observations from the Fathering Project's perspective that aligns with what you're saying. It was only yesterday I did a presentation to a major utility, and they've created really family-friendly workplaces. They've got thousands of employees in Perth, and they're not just the white-collar workers, but blue-collars, and they have opportunities to actually take flexible time. And what was interesting at the presentation, the CEO actually turned up to the presentation. So that strong leadership at the top to show that the family is important is really critical from our perspective. We're also doing some work with some resource companies. So BHP, for example, back in 2015, their purpose was to create long-term shareholder value, and they're a little bit extra as well. They've changed that now around to our purpose is to bring people and resources together. So it's much more people focused. And I know that when we're talking to resource companies in WA, that our programs resonate across the workforce, because if we can normalise the behaviour of men in a family situation, being a parent, then it actually normalises that behaviour for the women as well. So it actually helps with the gender equity objectives that BHP are trying to achieve in trying to have 50% of their workforce female by 2025. So it's really interesting that a lot of the experience we're having in the corporate workforce, the workforce are fairly similar. And equally with the programs, we're finding if we can create an environment for men to talk, they're very keen to talk. It's actually creating that environment that they've got some safety and they feel confident with their peers that they can actually take a few more risks and open up and share their actual feelings. So we've got some great questions coming through, and really looking around. There's one here from Fiona, just really asking about language. What can we do to equip men to have the appropriate language to speak about their emotions, and also ensure our language is drawing men into the conversation? Anyone have any comments to the general panel around language? Perhaps, Tom, you could come in here in your experience of hands-on. Have you got anything you might be able to add around the language that men use or that we use in general in the society?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this answers the question entirely, but I do think we need bridges from this deeply entrenched male stereotype to a more aspirational expression of masculinity. And so for us, language is incredibly important in the way that we frame up emotion. We might have the aspiration for boys to be, open-hearted and vulnerable and all of those things, but unfortunately, there's not a long queue of guys bashing down the door to be labelled those things. And so when we go in, we run workshops where we label it talking with gravity. Every male, every human being should be able to talk with gravity, and that means talking about things that carry weight and depth. If we can talk about the things that carry weight and depth, we won't move away from vulnerable conversations. We should be able to shed a tear at times, and shed a tear is quite different from saying, we should be able to cry, and sob and things like that. Unfortunately, there's this entrenched barrier to that type of language. And so we need to provide pathways towards that reality. And so boys are much more likely to get up and even rule breaker. You know what I mean? Like when we say, like, who made the rules with this nail polish thing? Hey, we're all being very well-behaved boys with these rules, aren't we? You watch them suddenly go, well, I don't give a stuff. I'm going to break it. And then all the guys lining up at the end say, I'll put on some nail polish, just stuff everybody. I don't care. I'll make my own rules. And how suddenly you can flip that, I'm going to follow the rules of the stereotype to nobody's the boss of me. I'm going to break it. I'm going to cry. I'll be the first to cry. Watch me go, because I don't care. And so we can actually use the same construct that is keeping us trapped to free us. And I think that's the smartest way to go, personally. Otherwise, we're asking for this huge gap that we're trying to leap. And so language can be a really important pathway. Talking with gravity, being able to talk when your voice is a little bit shaky, your stomach's turning upside down, like you're jumping off a cliff. To be able to hold space for your mate, just hold space, hold the line, hold the line. Or for us, step to the line when it's your truth. And can you step to the line? Nobody will be there with you. You'll be on your own. Can you still stay there, standing there when it's your truth, and own it? Wear your truth on your sleeve. Like that kind of language for a lot of guys, it's like, oh yeah, this kind of sounds like what I feel like I need to identify with, but it gives me a pathway to express myself completely differently. I can express the feminine side of myself, but you're giving me some nice labels that are giving me a bit of a bridge between those two things. So in that way, I think language is incredibly powerful.
We've just got a whole host of questions and comments that have come in, and we won't be able to answer all of them. For those who have sent in a comment, we'll seek to send something back to you after this. One of the comments from Michael was that 1 in 5 single-parent households are now fathers. I'm one of them. While it's factually uncommon, It should never be seen as unusual or odd. And interestingly, in our programs that we're running, we're finding the same thing, that there's a huge number of single parent households who are actually fathers. I don't know if anyone wants any comment on that. But LT has made a number of comments, and thanks for that. And it's really around creating a vision for how we can progress forward. And LT questions the group that we've got here now, educated, white collar, white, and also talking around, we've been talking in the corporate sphere, but the blue collar workers. Is there something that we can do to be more embracing across the board to try and advance the vision of what we're trying to achieve in terms of healthy masculinity? Rob, do you want to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, sure. Look, and I appreciate we're rapidly running out of time. Yeah, look, it's a very fair point, and I think to advance this masculinity debate, for me, it really is collaboration. There are a lot of good people, a lot of good organisations doing program work, or like Tom's group, Tomorrow Man, working in classrooms, or Paul's in boardrooms. I think if we're really to make the systemic change we've started to talk about today, it is better collaboration. It's working together. It's understanding what impacts different entities and different actors are trying to make. I think we've got a lot of well-meaning people out there doing work, but we haven't kind of brought it together. I'm hoping these sorts of forums going forward will be a really good vehicle to get the right people in the room to discuss it. And to that last point, yes, we need a diversity of men and a diversity of experiences and backgrounds and storytelling. It's just critical if we're going to expand out masculinity.
So just to close it out, because we are rapidly running out of time, if we can just ask each of the panelists to give a 30-second snapshot that if you click your fingers, what would you do to make an instant change? What's your call to action? So can we have just a 30-second overview from each of you? Perhaps David, if you could start first, and then I'll take you through each of the panelists after that. So what's your quick fire? What could you do if you could click your fingers, Rob? Or David, sorry.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I would have a national program that you would have business and the trade union movement and government, state and federal behind a healthy masculinity project, to see this as a matter of national urgency and as an emergency, because the suicide rate amongst men is self-evident. And I think the second part of it would be that, and it speaks to what others have said, but there is this great longing, even if you don't know that the longing is there. There is a yearning, as Paul said, a longing to actually live a different way, to have a different kind of relationship with the person that you're in partnership with, to be in relationship with your children in a different way, and the freeing that happens when that hunger to live differently gets met is fantastic for your sense of well-being. And I think that is a future fit for purpose that men actually want to become part of.
Okay, Rob, 30 seconds. What could you do?
Yep.
What would you call to action?
Look, I like what David's suggestion was. I think having the resources we've been talking about, that David and Tom talked about, having that available for kids, young boys, all the way through to grown men, like we have here on the panel today. I think that is so important to show people there's the information, there's a new way that you can act like a man and have the support there. I think that's hugely valuable. I would love to see that sort of being put out there in the community, and then to have the collaboration off the back of that.
Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. So, look, taking a kind of organisational perspective, for me, it'd be two things. It would be, one, everyone pushing to get the right kind of policies in organisations, to understand what best practice looks like and to make sure that they get it into their organisation, to band together with other like-minded people and put pressure on the organisation to do that. So that'd be one thing. The second really important thing, and this is particularly true for senior male leaders, would be to work more flexibly, but to do that really visibly and to tell stories about it and to really start to shift the norms such that it is okay for men to work more flexibly. If you think about it from this perspective, on our deathbeds, I think very few of us will say, "Oh, I wish I worked more hours." Whereas I think, many of us will say, I'm really glad I spent that time I did with my families and with my children and being a good partner. And I think if we just remember that, then we'll all start moving in a much better direction.
Excellent. And Tom?
Yeah, I'm going to build on all of that. I think that, we all hope for massive macro institutional change and a different education that equips young people for a full, adult life, the ups and downs of an emotional life and the big questions rather than just for a vocation. And I'm not saying it's that limited, but it's a little bit too skewed towards vocation over living a healthy life. I think in the meantime, before the cavalry comes on that one, it's the everyman, it's localized change that are going to change things. And so you think about every environment where a young man grows up, whether it's the cricket club, the footy club, music classes, the school, all of those environments, the home. Let's turn all of those into an intervention that shows that masculinity can be far broader and more fulfilling than it is at the moment. I would love to see programs like Tomorrow Man made redundant, because there's all this cluster action happening. And I think every young man needs to be to that visibility point. They need visibility of a man showing them that it can be done differently. And that is the every man and the every woman across Australia taking up this fight. It's not waiting for the program to come or the government to change the education system. It's actually saying, let's grassroots guerrilla tackle this and pioneer a new way and make it visible to every young man that's growing up so they know that they've got options.
Excellent. Thank you. And thanks to all our panel. Thanks to Rob for coordinating, his team for coordinating this webinar. I think we've just put our oar in the water from our perspective, and I think there's lots that can be done. Thanks to all the audience that were tuning in today. This webinar will be available on the Fathering Project website this afternoon. So if you'd like to share it with friends to open the conversation, please do so. And we hope that the group that we've attracted to listen to this, we can in some way galvanise your support and speak with a common voice to achieve the aims that we're seeking to achieve. So thanks everyone for your attention. Thanks for all the panelists and the work that you've done. It's greatly appreciated, and good afternoon to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us.